For those of you who can, think back to 1950. Did you know the people you lived next to back then? Mostly yeses. Did your parents know them if you can't quite remember? Yeah, I know mine did. How about today? How many of you can, just raise your hands, how many of you can say you are well acquainted? You know their names, maybe you know where they go to work, you know if there's children in the house. Of all the people whose homes are contiguous to your own, both sides, back, I'm going to say about half and half. About half and half. It's a sign of our times, isn't it? Isn't that something that has really changed in our lives? That there are so many of us who don't know who our neighbors are, really. Or we may not know them at all, right? I've told this story before, but it bears telling again. Loretta Francham and I went to a workshop about a couple years ago now, maybe, huh? And it was a workshop on caring for elders in congregations, and the presenter was a psychologist who shared with us his story that I think it happened sometime that year, where he went to visit the neighbors next door who had just moved in. And so he went and knocked on the door, rang the bell, and a young woman opened the door, and she said, "What do you want?" And he put his best smile on, and he said, "Well, I'm your next door neighbor, and I just came by to introduce myself and welcome you to the neighborhood." And she said, "We don't need to know you." And she closed the door. We were stunned, right? And everybody hearing that story was stunned. What a sad commentary, friends, on the society that every one of us has helped create over the past, 70 years? How sad. So our Catchy slogan this week in this series, Catchy Community, these are reminding us how very clear corporations are about their purpose, about why they even exist. Our catchy one, you know this one. Like a good neighbor, what? State Farm is there. Ooh, they have you so well trained. Yes. But what I want you to notice, I know you've got it down, but what I want you to notice is they don't just say like a neighbor, they say like a good neighbor. Doesn't that just beg the question? What is a good neighbor? As I'm looking around for neighbors online, I find there is actually a bunch of places where you can go get tips on how to be a good neighbor. Really, we need tips now. Apparently we do. So, what does it take for someone to earn your seal of approval as a good neighbor? What is it that makes a good neighbor for you? What are they like? They're quiet. Said someone who used to get up very early, and now you're retired, you want to sleep in. Don't start those those leaf blowers, right? What else? What makes a good neighbor? Helping them out. Okay, good. What else? What makes a good neighbor? What? They have a cat and not a dog. Oops. That's 2 strikes against Paul and I. Go ahead. Somebody else? No? Okay. All right. Who else? Yeah, go ahead, Joyce. They're friendly. They greet you. They say hello when you see them. Yes, these are good neighbors. What else? Anything else? I'm sure you've got long lists. Oh, Lois, I see your hand. Oh, that goes way back, doesn't it? They borrow a cup of sugar. Oh, nice. And you've got one to share. Oh, those were the days, huh? Good. Oh, Ken, go ahead.
They take care of your pool when you're gone.
Of your pool? I volunteer. They take care of your pool when you're gone. Great. Shirley.
They watch out for each other.
Yes, they watch out for one another, for your homes, for whatever's going on, right? Well, according to State Farm, a good neighbor is someone who's there. What do they mean? There.
When you need them.
Yes. It's not really a place, it's a when, right? Like Robert Oates, it's when you need an insurance company. And probably for the most part, we're talking about auto collisions and home fires and any kind of natural disaster that would affect you, right? What their message is that whatever awful thing you may be going through, State Farm is right there at your side, sleeves rolled up, ready to pitch in to help you into whatever recovery you need, right? That's a powerful message, isn't it? It's a powerful message. Is that something that the church can say? That we communicate that effectively to the people around us? What? Occasionally. That's probably where I am. With some things, yes, and with some things, not so much. Right? If we're honest. Some things, yes. And even some things they might say as a denomination, we're there. And can we say the same for Centennial as an individual congregation? Some things, yes. Some things, maybe not so much. Well, let's look at this a little more closely. The word neighborhood probably for the whole of your life has meant a place, right? A location. But I want to invite you this morning to think about it a little differently. Think about it as a vocation. What's a vocation? A calling, right? A way of being. A way to be specifically in relationship is a vocation. Let me help you see what I'm talking about. Think of neighborhood. It's the hood part. Fatherhood, motherhood. I'm in the priesthood. That hood part is about a state of heart and mind, not geography, right? So then what does neighborhood mean? Neighborhood. Anybody been to Tokyo? Were you brave enough to use the subway? Think about what it's like on the subway. Lots of people packed together like sardines, and yet you may or may not have that thing we call community, right? You may not have community. You may even be on the streets of Tokyo, body to body, they tell me sometimes, and not have community. It could be the same anywhere here where we're crowded, because neighborhoodness is about community. It's about how we choose to make relationships with other people to create the society that we live in. It's a choice. It's a calling. It's a way to be. Neighborhood, right? Choosing to be neighbors. And I think State Farm actually has their finger on something really important here, because I think it's true that disasters have a way of distinguishing between neighbors and good neighbors, don't they? In disasters, those good neighbors are those who choose to go out of their way to meet the needs of people in dire need. Dire need. I had a lot of drama in my life yesterday, my own little disasters, little world of disasters, nothing compared to what the big world is going through. But one of the things that happened was on my way to see Lecky at the hospital, my car broke down. And when I went back to pick it up, which they couldn't fix it, the valet there just had to tell me a story that he had heard about Butte County, the campfire. And he told me that he heard a story, and I had just heard him tell this story to a woman in front of me. But when I got up in line, he just had to tell me. But he told me that this woman was driving her car into the fire, and as she did so, she saw an elderly woman leaving her house, one of those last to leave, and she was leaving on foot, trying to escape. And so the woman pulled over, picked her up, drove her to a safe place, dropped her off, and headed back into the fire to her family. And she never came back. Now, I don't know whether that's mythology or historic fact, but what I noticed was how incredibly important that story was to that young man. Why? What was happening in his heart? It was about community in times of dire need. Someone who had chosen to put her own, maybe even her own family's life at risk for someone else. That's powerful, isn't it? That's powerful. Jesus takes our definitions of good neighbors and completely turns them over on their head. You know why? Because he doesn't care anything about location. Utterly irrelevant in his mind. There's no where about it at all. And he also doesn't give a fig about the character of those neighbors, those other people, whether they're considerate about their dogs or the noise they're making. He doesn't care whether they're nice and friendly and greet you every morning. He doesn't care about anything except you. There's only one part in Jesus' definition of a good neighbor, and it's all about you. Whether and how you respond by being a good neighbor. That's his story, isn't it? He wants to know, are you living neighborhood? Are you living a vocation of responding to others in need? That's what he cares about the most, just like State Farm, the people in dire need. Jesus is very clear with us that there's no difference between loving God and loving your neighbor. He wants to know, do you feel the pain? Do you feel the pain? Remember this hymn we just sang. Do you feel the pain of the people who are living in pain, experiencing loss? The migrants, African Americans who are still waiting for deep-seated bigotry in this country to stop killing their children. They're waiting. Do you feel the pain of all of the folks from Fiji and Tonga watching what's happening on our southern border, knowing that when the doors of asylum are slammed there, they're slammed on them too? Are you feeling their pain? These words, love of neighbor is not easy, cuts us till we feel the pain. Love of neighbor sets us squarely in the place where they now sit. That's what was happening in those stories. And all the many other stories that we hear coming out of these wildfires, stories of rescue, stories of courage and goodness and compassion. Do you feel the pain of that one neighbor? It's somebody's neighbor who is slowly dissolving into a mind state of hatred and loneliness and aloneness that will one day be visible to us all as another mass shooting. Can you feel his pain? Jesus says there's not one hair of difference between your love of God and your love of neighbor, the people you choose to make a relationship with. So if you're tired of all the bad news, of all the sickness and the sorrow, then I leave you with this question, Centennial. Who will you neighbor that you haven't yet in the year to come? Who will you neighbor? Just like State Farm and just like Jesus, it's those neighbors that we're afraid of, that we're sick and tired of, that we're disappointed in, that we don't like. It's those neighbors that we're called to be in relationship with. Who will you neighbor in the year to come? Let me invite you to remember that as we wrestle with this world and how we respond to it as disciples and followers of Jesus, let me remind you that we have a God who never, ever stops calling, but also never, ever stops giving whatever it is we need to offer.